We started the first game of our league on the play with a powerful hand. Ideally, the Consider would allow us to find additional rituals, and having 2 cost reducers meant we were not as susceptible to removal. Plus, having a win condition from the beginning is always a good sign. We played our Sparble of Canal and passed to the opponent, holding up our Consider for the end of their turn when we had additional information about the matchup. Silver Bluff Bridge entered the battlefield tapped, and I immediately knew they were playing Affinity. Consider showed Serum Visions on top of my library. It was put into my graveyard, and a Goblin Electromancer was added to my hand. Another Sparble of Canal was my draw for the turn. I played it, and cast one of my cost reducers, Brawl, Chief of Compliance. Things were looking good, but I was well aware of how quickly things can turn around when playing against Affinity. It started innocently enough. Darksteel Citadel, followed by Memnite, and then a Springleaf draw. My opponent drawing 2 cards for a single blue off Thoughtcast was far from ideal, but I still felt as though things were under control. My opponent then added a Welding Jar and a Frogmite to the battlefield, before using Galvanic Blast Metalcraft ability to kill my Brawl, Chief of Compliance. At least I have a backup, I thought to myself. My draw for the turn was Gifts Ungiven. Unfortunately, I did not have the mana to cast it this turn, and was forced to settle for playing out another cost reducer before passing the turn. My opponent's third turn in the game was when things truly began to spiral out of control. A 1-mana Thought Monitor let them draw 2 cards while adding Flying Threat to the board. Opponent then played out Basic Island before casting Frogmite, and followed it up with a Cranial Plating. They floated mana with a newly summoned creature, and I was soon facing down a 10-1 Memnite. Both it and the original Frogmite rumbled into the red zone, and my life total was quickly cut in half. I drew additional Goblin Electromancer and began processing my next move. Surely, if I were to win this game, something big would have to happen this turn. After a few moments of thought, I made my move. Desperate Ritual gave me 3 red mana in my pool, and I was then able to cast Gifts Ungiven while still leaving 1 red mana in my pool. I selected Grapeshot, Desperate Ritual, Manamorphose, and Past in Flames, crossing my fingers that my opponent would make the wrong decision. Unfortunately, they did not. Past in Flames and Grapeshot were out of my hand, and I still only had a red mana in my pool. I attempted to target the Memnite and Thought Monitor with my Grapeshot. My opponent gave the soon-to-be lethal flyer a Regeneration Shield, and we were headed to the next game. My opening hand for Game 2 was average at best, but I still decided to keep and hope I would find a few rituals at the top of my library. I began the game with a Sparble of Canal, which allowed me to cast Serum Visions. Gifts Ungiven and Goblin Electromancer were not rituals, and both were pushed to the bottom of my library. My opponent started with a Sparble of Bridge, and then played an Ornithopter and a Tormod's Crypt before passing the turn. Graveyard Interaction is quite strong against our deck, but we can usually fight through it. Desperate Ritual was a nice pickup. I cast Brawl, Chief of Compliance, and passed it back to my opponent. Unfortunately, they were gearing up for an incredible second turn. Darksteel Citadel gave them a 4th artifact, and they were able to play 2 Frogmites for free. A 1-mana Thought Monitor let them dig deeper into their library. They cast Grafdigger's Cage, before adding 6 more power to the board, with a 3rd Frogmite and a Sojourner's Companion. I drew another ritual for the turn, and things were really beginning to look bleak. I fired off a Consider, putting a Shivan Reef into my graveyard and drawing another Consider. The second cantrip showed Serum Visions. That too was placed into the graveyard, and a Gifts Ungiven was added to my hand. All I could do was play out the Shivan Reef and pass the turn back to my opponent. They played out a Spire of Industry and attacked with everything besides the Ornithopter. Brawl blocked the Frogmite, and I once again found myself at 10 life. My opponent played with Memnite and passed the turn. They were empty-handed, but it hardly mattered. With 2 pieces of Graveyard Interaction on the board, it would be extremely difficult for me to build up a large storm count. Lightning Bolt was the draw. I desperately cast my ritual, and followed it up with a Pyretic Ritual and a Gifts Ungiven. 3 red mana remained in my pool. I selected Grapeshot, Shattering Spree, Manamorphose, and Pyretic Ritual. In hindsight, these were likely not the best cards to pick, but it is unclear if I could win either way. My opponent gave me both rituals. I cast a Manamorphose, adding a blue and red to my pool. Otawara seemed like it may help, but it would require a mistake from my opponent. With no better options, I fired off my ritual, and then used Otawara's channeling ability to target the Tormod's Crypt. My opponent exiled my graveyard in response, and after doing some quick combat math, I conceded the game.